Welcome to the Devils in the Details, where the strange, the supernatural, and the downright bizarre come to life. I'm your host, Sarah Ashman, and each episode will take a deep dive into the hidden corners of the occult and the paranormal, peeling back the layers of conspiracy that lurk beneath the surface. From ancient rituals to modern-day mysteries, nothing is too strange for us to explore. So grab a candle, light some incense, and get ready to uncover the secrets that others don't dare to ask. The Devils in the Details. Let's find out why. Okay, so welcome to episode 5. I'm Sarah Ashman, your host of the Devils in the Details podcast. This is now the 4th time I have attempted to record this episode. It would appear to be cursed. I have switched podcast platforms and finally purchased a new laptop. The first couple of times I recorded this, I just actually didn't like the way the episode turned out. It had nothing to do with the software or the laptop. And then when I finally got on this new software, which I'll talk about here in a second, and recorded something, my old laptop, which, is a 8 or 9 year old MacBook, which it seems like MacBooks have about a 6 or 7 year shelf life as far as when they start to go so obsolete that Mac will no longer, or Apple will no longer let you even update the software, which is by design to make you buy a new one, obviously. So I switched from Riverside to Descript, which I so far really like. This will be the first episode I have actually produced on Descript, but Riverside just continued to have issues with thinking that my browser was constantly in incognito mode, despite the fact that it wasn't, trying to switch browsers, login issues, resetting password, getting locked out, all kinds of problems with that software. So I ended up just trashing it and going with something new. So we'll see how this works. I do really like that Descript lets me put my script that I've already put together and worked very hard on into a sort of teleprompter feature here so that I don't have to constantly keep glancing down at my notes or anything like that. So without further ado, let's get into episode 5. This is going to be on the Georgia Guidestones. Just off a 2-lane road in rural Elbert County, Georgia, the hills open into a quiet clearing. Cows graze nearby, cicadas hum, and for more than 40 years, 4 towering granite slabs stood here, casting long shadows that seemed older than the country itself. They were called the Georgia Guidestones. To some, they were an American Stonehenge, a message of peace and reason carved in stone. To others, they were a warning from the powerful, the opening lines of a manifesto for a coming new world order. When they were destroyed in 2022, they left behind questions that still echo, like who built them, why the secrecy, and were they a call to enlightenment or control? So starting out, it began in the summer of 1979. A man calling himself R.C. Christian walked into the Elberton Granite Finishing Company, the same business that carved headstones for half of Georgia. He was polite, wealthy, and as the company president later put it, a man who chose his words like an engineer draws blueprints. Christian said he represented a small group of loyal Americans. Their goal was to build a monument that would guide humanity after a future global catastrophe. He asked for secrecy, he offered cash, and he provided exact specifications. Astronomical alignments, dimensions, inscriptions in 8 modern languages and 4 ancient scripts. The company's president thought it was a prank. Then Christian produced a suitcase full of money. Within months, the land was purchased, the stones were quarried, and construction began. In March 1980, the Georgia Guidestones were unveiled before a small local crowd. Farmers, town officials, and a few curious reporters. Standing nearly 20 feet high and weighing over 119 tons, the monument looked timeless and also completely out of place. At its base, a granite tablet described the project, naming R.C. Christian, obviously a pseudonym, as its sponsor. And across its faces, 10 rules or commandments were carved. Let's talk about what those guidelines, rules, or commandments were. Each line read like it had been written for a new civilization. 1. Maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. 2. Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity. 3. Unite humanity with a living new language. 4, rule passion, faith, tradition, and all things with tempered reason. 5, protect people and nations with fair laws and just courts. 6, let all nations rule internally, resolving external disputes in a world court. 7, avoid petty laws and useless officials. 8, balance personal rights with social duties. 9, prize truth, beauty, love, seeking harmony with the infinite. And 10, be not a cancer on the earth. Leave room for nature. Leave room for nature. Okay, so to some, this was an ecological charter for the future, a call for stewardship after chaos. To others, it was chilling. Maintain humanity under 500 million. That would mean reducing the world's population by more than 90%. So the debate began immediately and it never stopped. Elberton was a deeply religious town, obviously being part of the Bible Belt. Many residents saw the Guidestones as pagan and even satanic. Local pastors preached sermons calling them the devil's commandments. But tourists came anyway, spiritual seekers, UFO enthusiasts, college students, survivalists. And for 40 years, the Guidestones drew visitors from around the world. Some left flowers, others spray-painted Bible verses across the granite. One local sheriff joked, "It's our biggest mystery and our biggest headache." Only one person claimed to know the builder's identity, the banker Wyatt Martin, who managed the trust that paid for the project. Before his death in 2019, Martin told reporters, R.C. Christian was not a group, he was one man, highly intelligent, determined, and sincere. I gave him my word of confidentiality, and I intend to keep it. But clues emerged. Internet sleuths are going to internet sleuth. Investigators connected the pseudonym R.C. Christian to the Rosicrucians, a 17th century mystical order devoted to secret wisdom and the dawning of a new age of reason. Later, journalists uncovered a Midwestern doctor named Herbert Hensey Kirsten, who fit the description perfectly. He was wealthy, educated, fascinated by eugenics and global governance, and the author of letters using the same phrasing as R.C. Christian's own correspondence. Kirsten's 1986 book, Common Sense Renewed, argued that nationalism must be replaced by world government and that population must be reduced to a manageable size. If Kirsten was R.C. Christian, the Guidestones were not a mystical prank, they were his manifesto in stone. So were they a blueprint or a warning? In the decades that followed, researchers began to see the Guidestones not as isolated oddities, but as part of a pattern. They noticed how the Stones' commandments paralleled the rhetoric of global conferences, the United Nations Agenda 21 and later Agenda 2030, and the World Economic Forum's vision of a, quote, Great Reset. Population control, environmental balance, global governance, different language, same themes. To believers, it looked like the Guidestones had predicted or even inspired the technocratic future taking shape. And to skeptics, it was coincidence born of shared anxieties: nuclear war, famine, climate collapse. In 1980, the Cold War still loomed. Apocalyptic thinking was mainstream. Survivalist manuals, doomsday bunkers, population control debates, they were all over the place. The Guidestones could easily have been a response to that fear, a manual for rebuilding if the worst ever happened. But their phrasing, cold, managerial, almost corporate, felt less like hope and more like policy. Because the stones were aligned with the sun, moon, and stars, some visitors compared them to ancient temples, Stonehenge, the pyramids, even Masonic lodges. Each hole and slot in the granite served an astronomical purpose, tracking the solstices, marking noon, and identifying Polaris. To astronomers, it was a pretty clever design. To conspiracy theorists, it was evidence of an occult message. A new temple built for the age of science, not faith. I just have to insert here, I love how especially fundamentalist Christian or Christian nationalist conspiracy theorists perceive everything as occult, satanic, or demonic. Their definition of what is acceptable or good is so extremely narrow that even science is evil. It's just, it's so interesting. As I was researching this episode, a lot of the content that I came across was written from such a biased perspective of people who are terrified of science, New Age enlightenment, and spiritual evolution. But we're going to get into the dynamics of the kind of oppressive and dogmatic religious viewpoints that fuel the fear behind some of the conspiracies surrounding the Guidestones. The secrecy around R.C. Christian's group only fueled speculation as well. Were they Freemasons, Rosicrucians, elitist humanists, or something darker like architects of a Luciferian New World Order? By the early 2000s, the Guidestones had become a fixture in documentaries about the Illuminati and global population control. They appeared in Alex Jones's Endgame, in online forums, and later in QAnon threads. Each generation reinterpreted the granite to fit its own fears. Then, on the morning of July 6, 2022, at 4:03 a.m., a flash lit the Georgia sky. Security cameras captured an explosion ripping through the monument, shattering one of its 4 main stones. By that afternoon, county officials bulldozed what remained, citing safety concerns. No arrests, no suspects, no answers. For some, it was an act of vandalism. For others, a symbolic strike against the global elite. I'm going to say global elite. Still others whispered that the destruction was orchestrated. An inside job to erase the evidence now that phase 2 of the plan was underway. Whatever the truth, the Guidestones were gone, and in their absence, their legend grew even larger. Every society wrestles with the same question. How much control is necessary to survive, and how much freedom can it afford to lose? The Guidestones claim to offer balance, order through reason, harmony with nature, a unified humanity. But balance can look a lot like obedience. If humanity must be reduced to 500 million people to find peace, who decides who stays? If personal rights have to yield to social duties, who writes the rules? That tension between reason and morality, progress and compassion is what made the Guidestones so haunting. They mirrored both our hopes and our hubris. In the end, the Guidestones may not have been evil. They may have been a warning about what happens when enlightenment loses empathy, when logic forgets love. So let's talk about the legacy. Today, nothing remains of the monument but the foundation. The field has been fenced off, the rubble stored in a county warehouse. But online, the Guidestones live on in podcasts, documentaries, digital archives. They've become a symbol of the 21st century. A world simultaneously obsessed with knowledge and consumed by distrust. Maybe that's why they mattered, because they forced us to ask who decides what wisdom means and what price we will pay to follow it. Everyone say hi to Steve for a second. He loves being on camera. Next time we step beyond the monument itself into the deeper currents that fed its ideas. We'll explore how Luciferian philosophy, occult symbolism, and spiritual rebellion have shaped our concept of power. So next, I want to step beyond the monument itself and into the deeper currents that fed its ideas. Let's explore some Luciferian philosophy, its occult symbolism, because this is, after all, a podcast about occult conspiracies, and then spiritual rebellion, and how that shapes our concept of power. Why authoritarian movements, especially religious ones, often fear spiritual freedom most of all. Okay, so let's leave the stones behind and follow the current that runs underneath them through centuries of secret philosophy, rebellion, faith. This is the story of the, quote, light bringer of the occult and why authoritarian power, political or religious, so often fears spiritual freedom itself. How timely. All right, so long before he was cast as the devil, Lucifer meant something else entirely. In Latin, lux means light, and fera means to bear, the morning star Venus shining at dawn. In ancient Rome, poets like Cicero and Virgil used Lucifer as a symbol of beauty, enlightenment, and renewal. Keep in mind, this is long before any of the Hebrew texts ever mentioned Lucifer. It wasn't until the 4th century AD that the word took a darker turn. When St. Jerome translated Isaiah 14 into Latin, he rendered a Hebrew phrase, Helel ben Shachar, shining one, son of the morning, as Lucifer. However, that phrase did not refer to the devil or Lucifer in what modern Christians consider to be the devil or Satan. In that book, it actually referred to a person, someone else entirely different. That one mistranslation, over time, Christian theologians read the verse not as satire about a Babylonian king, which was who it was intended to be about, but as a story of Satan's fall. The Lightbringer became the rebel angel, and knowledge became disobedience, and the pursuit of enlightenment became the first sin. I'm going to pause for a second and ask how many of you draw a conclusion and a parallel between that story and what we're seeing play out immediately right now on not just the world stage, but on the national stage, where science and education are becoming literally demonized as evil. They're wrong. They're being attacked. They're under attack, right? From government institutions, from world powers. This is a theme, and we're going to come back to this, but I just want to point out, keep that in mind as we're talking about this concept of enlightenment and spiritual growth. This recasting of light into darkness, keep in mind, originally Lucifer was a deity that was worshipped as a god of enlightenment, okay? This set the stage for centuries of tension between faith and reason. And that is a fault line that still runs through our modern culture. Again, we're seeing this right now happen. When people hear Luciferian, they imagine ritual and rebellion, but historically, Luciferianism and Satanism are cousins, not twins. And I would make the argument they are extremely distant cousins. There are different flavors of Satanism. So Satanism, especially the modern Levian form, treats Satan as a metaphor for personal autonomy, rebellion as a form of empowerment. I do want to differentiate that the Church of Satan, which is based on Anton LaVey's The Satanic Bible and his teachings, is a completely separate and different experience from the Satanic Temple, which is for all intents and purposes, an atheist humanist organization. The Satanic Temple is a nonprofit religious organization that is not based on organized religion. It is based on a humanist approach to supporting personal freedoms and intellectual advancement. Two different organizations and two different experiences. Luciferianism goes further inward. It views Lucifer not as chaos, but as the archetype of enlightenment, because that was what Lucifer was originally. Humanity seeks divine knowledge within itself. And that is the message of Luciferianism, is that we are all fragments of the divine, and the divine is experiencing this life through us, whether you refer to the divine as God or anything else. In a way, the Luciferian believes that salvation doesn't descend from heaven. It awakens from within. Only you can save yourself. And there is no such thing as being forgiven by a higher power if you don't do anything to earn that forgiveness. You are responsible for your own personal enlightenment. That idea sounds noble and dangerously independent to anyone who demands obedience. And if you look at all of the major organized religions across the world today, particularly those that fall into the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, those are very demanding of obedience. They are built on structures that demand submission to a higher power rather than encourage individuals to discover the higher power within themselves and to develop a relationship with their higher power on their own terms. To authoritarian religion, that's blasphemy. And to mystical traditions, it's evolution. Okay, so occult threads. Through the 19th and 20th centuries, movements like Theosophy and Rosicrucianism reimagined this inner light philosophy. Theosophy, which was founded by Helena Blavatsky, taught that humanity is evolving toward higher consciousness, guided by hidden masters, adepts who preserve ancient wisdom. Her successor, Alice Bailey, took the idea global. In 1922, she and her husband founded the Lucifer Publishing Company, later renamed the Lucis Trust. Bailey wrote that the coming age of Aquarius, which we are currently in right now, would dissolve old religions and unite humanity under a spiritual democracy. I'm going to take just a little jot off of the trail for a second and tell you, as somebody who remains very connected to the spiritual consciousness and participates in many forms of spiritual gathering across many different religious and spiritual paths, I'm telling you right now, we're watching the dissolution of old religions right now on the world stage. We are seeing it happen before our eyes. It's been gradually and incrementally happening over the last few decades, but we are in an age right now, again, that age of Aquarius, where we're watching old, outdated, and archaic religious systems crumble. And they're doing so pretty messily, to be honest. It's pretty messy. We're watching it. Look at what's happening within the United States with the rise of Christian nationalism, with the ties of Israel, right? What Israel's doing on the world stage. Look at all of the ways in which old, archaic religious systems are falling out of favor. And they're doing so because humanity, despite those religious systems trying so hard to stop it, humanity is waking up. Humanity is waking up and asking questions and becoming more enlightened. Humanity wants to be connected. We're not saying that humanity wants to get rid of our international borders, right? We're not saying that we're heading towards one global government necessarily. What we're saying is we want our interactions and our contribution to the planet to consider all of the other people that have to live on this planet too. And that is most certainly not how organized religion has functioned, and that is a dangerous message to organized religious structures. The Lucis Trust still exists today. It holds consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and it operates an organization called World Goodwill, which promotes international cooperation and meditation for peace. Cool. Sounds fun. To followers, it's humanitarian. To critics, again, it's the skeleton of a one-world spiritual government, the same ideal worshipped by the Guidestones. So this is where some of these occult conspiracies come into play, that the Guidestones were developed by this Luciferian society to encourage people to participate in these international one-world spiritual governments, which I could see how someone who is very entrenched in a dogmatic religion would view it that way. However, nobody's making anybody do anything here. So let's talk a little bit about Prometheus and the archetype of the Promethean rebel, because we're speaking about Lucifer and the Luciferian paradigm. Every culture has its light bringer. In Greece, it was Prometheus who stole fire from the gods to give to mankind. For that act of compassion and defiance, Zeus chained him to a rock, his liver eaten each day by an eagle. Lucifer and Prometheus share the same mythic DNA, punished not for hatred, but for the gift of knowledge. In art and philosophy, the two often merge into the archetype of the Promethean rebel, the one who says, "Let there be light," even when it is forbidden. Now, during the European Enlightenment, that symbolism returned with force. Thinkers like Voltaire and Diderot celebrated reason over revelation and science over superstition. To the church, they were dangerous, and to later generations, they were liberators. Think about the people right now who are pushing messages of enlightenment and personal freedoms. They are viewed as dangerous to authoritarian structures and regimes. The Guidestones line, "Rule passion, faith, and tradition with tempered reason," could have come straight from an Enlightenment pamphlet. These are not new statements. And you continue to see them come up over time throughout history by Enlightenment thinkers who have given us some of the most important texts, directions, and who have been the catalyst for some of the most revolutionary times, including our own revolution here in America. So let's fast forward to the mid-20th century. After 2 world wars and the dawn of nuclear weapons, humanity faced its own capacity for destruction. Out of that fear grew the New Age movement, which blended Eastern mysticism, psychology, and theosophy into this global vision of awakening. It promised a shift from the Piscean age, Pisces associated with the fish, associated with Jesus and Christianity, ruled by faith and hierarchy, to the Aquarian age, which was ruled by knowledge, technology, and unity. In the 21st century, that spiritual evolution found a technological mirror called transhumanism. The idea that science will allow us to transcend biology itself. Uploading consciousness, editing genes, and conquering death was humanity remaking itself in its own image. Now, to many Luciferians and New Age thinkers, that's the next step in enlightenment. To critics, it's hubris, the Tower of Babel rebuilt in silicone and code. I will say that gene editing, so there's kind of this theme of the Guidestones having ties, and especially the R.C. Christian, the writings of R.C. Christian, and especially if it was Herbert Kirsten, ties to eugenics. Now, eugenics has its roots in some pretty problematic ideas. On the surface, it sounds like, hey, couldn't we just create humans that are, quote, perfect? But there were many people who embraced eugenics, like the Nazis, for instance, who looked at it as, hey, we could create humans that we consider perfect. You can see where that's going. So eugenics has a very negative rap, and for good reason, because editing out, quote, undesirable traits from humans has been always problematic and always unethical. There are lots of problems with deciding what is desirable and what is not desirable. Now, with gene editing technology like CRISPR, I see there being some good that comes of this because we can edit out genetic disorders that would lead to either miscarriages, right? Like babies who can't even survive pregnancy because genetically they have a disorder that prevents them from being able to survive, or that could create problematic or dangerous birth conditions for the mother, or being born with certain genetic disorders where they're not even going to survive childhood and make it to adulthood. So I can see there being a lot of value in improving the quality of life of all humans being born. However, once we start to cross into what I think is a desirable trait versus editing out a genetic disorder that causes great harm and suffering to a human, there's a slippery slope that we get into. So I do think that the technological, biological revolution of gene editing and things like that has its place, but we have to be very careful, and we need to ask questions about bioethics as it concerns what exactly are we editing and what are we trying to create? Are we taking the place of the divine, or are we actually evolving to be able to increase the survival and reduce the suffering of humans? Now let's go back to Tower of Babel, because this is where people start to get into these kind of conspiracies of like, oh, one world government and everybody speaking the same language. So the Bible's Tower of Babel is one of the earliest stories about globalism. Humanity unites, they speak one language, and they build a tower to the heavens. God scatters them for their pride. Every attempt to create a universal order, whether it's political, economic, or spiritual, echoes Babel's dream. The Georgia Guidestones, with their call to unite humanity with a living new language, became a modern chapter of that myth. Now, architecturally, even the European Parliament building in Strasbourg was modeled after the unfinished Tower of Babel from Bruegel's painting, a very deliberate symbol of many tongues, one voice. To some, it's art. To others, it's a declaration. Humanity is finishing what Babel began. Okay, so let's go back to the satanic and Luciferian lens centering around these. Inside conspiracy culture, names like Texe Mars, Mark Dice, and the writers of Vigilant Citizen turned these parallels into prophecies. They argued that the Guidestones, the United Nations, and the World Economic Forum all trace back to Luciferian doctrine, replacing God's law with human reason. They saw environmentalism as a new religion of earth worship, eugenics as ritual sacrifice, and transhumanism as the final rebellion, humanity becoming its own creator. Texe Mars once wrote, "The New World Order is Satan's kingdom on earth disguised as a global utopia." Now, whether you believe that or not, his words reveal a deeper anxiety. That enlightenment without morality becomes tyranny dressed as progress. Now, I do agree with that statement. Texe Mars is problematic as a person because he is a very dogmatic and entrenched, almost cultist religious writer. But I do agree that the pursuit of enlightenment needs to incorporate morality, because without that morality and compassion and empathy for other human beings, it is going to end up being this cold and harsh progress, right? So I think that where people get hung up is they hear this like population reduction or population control, right? Which was that first commandment on the Georgia Guidestones. And they freak out, rightfully so, because they think, well, who gets to decide who stays? Morality has to be applied here. And I don't think anybody is arguing for a very immoral solution to the problem. I think that that is where alarmists have kind of taken that angle of the conspiracy. Okay, so as we're talking about that entrenched and dogmatic religious conditioning, let's touch on authoritarian faith and the fear of freedom. So why does spiritual independence scare authoritarian systems, especially religious ones? Because control depends on mediation. If truth lives within every single person, no priest, party, or president can own it. Throughout history, the same pattern repeats. Medieval churches banned personal Bible translation. Totalitarian regimes outlawed independent spirituality, and even modern movements brand dissenting mysticism as heresy or New Age deception. Pause for a second. How much oppression of free speech and free exercise of religion is occurring right now in the United States? We are beginning to see incremental encroachment on these two freedoms. And I'm going to make the prediction right now that it's going to continue until there is a mass uprising of this spiritual enlightenment across the globe. This isn't happening just in the United States. This is global enlightenment as people are casting off these oppressive systems. Christianity in and of itself doesn't have to be oppressive, but when applied under authoritarian control, it absolutely 100% is, and the history of books prove that. The Dark Ages were called the Dark Ages because they were incredibly dark, because the Catholic Church oppressed literally everybody. For Christian nationalist ideologues, spiritual autonomy threatens the chain of command, which is God, leader, people. They don't want anybody to talk to God directly. They need to have this human leader to grasp to that thread of control they have over the people who follow them. They need to have that human installed there because they don't know how to function without that person to tell them what to do. If the individual claims divine access, that chain breaks and chaos ensues. Chaos meaning people become happy. Can't have that. It's the same argument that got Giordano Bruno burned at the stake for saying stars were suns, which turned out to be true, and that the universe was infinite, also turned out to be true. Light challenging the hierarchy. Someone accessing divine information and divine guidance without the permission of a human in the middle? Of course, unrestrained freedom has its shadows too. The same search for inner divinity can spiral into narcissism, cults, or pseudoscientific utopias. Reason without compassion becomes cold, and faith without reason becomes cruel. There has to be this balance. Cults are a fantastic example of someone who is trying, who may initially start out trying to convince others to find the divinity in their lives and for that self-empowerment and spiritual enlightenment, but they get a little taste of power and influence and it goes off the rails, okay? So we know how that ends every single time. And that's the real tension at the heart of the Guidestones. They propose harmony, but by decree, and they promise balance, but through control. And it's this paradox of enlightenment. Can you guide humanity wisely without taking away its choice? And as Americans, we're absolutely terrified of somebody taking away our choice. Remember what happened when people were asked to wear these tiny little scraps of fabric on their face when there was a pandemic? They had meltdowns. We saw adults having tantrums because they were asked to wear a little piece of fabric to keep other people from contracting a disease that they might be carrying. We took away their choice and they hated it. So today, speaking of the pandemic, echoes of those debates resurface absolutely everywhere. Digital surveillance is sold as safety. We're seeing this happen right now. Palantir is a really great example of a global enterprise that is collecting or has already collected, let's be honest, data on absolutely every single one of us. Our health data, our biometric data, our financial data, our voting data, our social media data, our political belief data, our everything, right? Everything about us, our family, our friends, our networks. All of this digital surveillance is sold to us initially. Remember the Patriot Act and how controversial that was at the time? We willingly handed over access to all of the information about ourselves in the name of safety, right? Because 9/11 had just happened, and what about terrorists? So we're reaping what we sowed, right? But it's only gotten worse. So there's this digital surveillance. Look at what's happening or getting ready to happen, right? Amazon just announced that Ring cameras are going to start storing facial recognition. Who has access to that database? Anybody who wants to pay for it. Again, not even trying to start a conspiracy with that one, like it's already happened. Environmental policy is framed as moral salvation. So yes, we're killing our planet. How do we control that so right now we're watching individuals being told to reduce our carbon footprint rather than the corporations, businesses, and industries that are actually the ones polluting, right? It's our problem. We're the ones that are polluting is what we're being told. And our personal freedoms are being encroached upon because corporations, businesses, and industries don't want to change what they're doing. Religious politics demand conformity in the name of purity. So again, we're seeing this pushback and tension, especially in the United States right now with the rise of the far Christian right? Like that Christian nationalism that wants to continue to impose oppressive control systems over people who live in the United States. Because without that, how do you control people? There are these religious institutions, whether it's in the United States or elsewhere, that thrive on controlling people. They need to control the narrative. They don't want people to push back. They don't want people to protest. They don't want people to live free lives. And they need people to conform to these dogmatic, oppressive, and authoritarian systems. So each side here believes it's defending truth. Each fears the other's version of freedom. The result is a world of both hyper-connected and deeply divided, the very world the Guidestones seem to anticipate. Now, the Guidestones didn't necessarily have to be fortune tellers, right? Anybody could look at the way that society cyclically was moving to see that eventually we would end up where we have ended up, right? We're fighting culture wars instead of class wars. Perhaps that's why their destruction felt so symbolic. Not just the fall of granite, but the collapse of faith to some in reason and institutions, in the idea that anyone can speak for all humanity. All right, so I'm going to close here. Whether we call it Luciferian light or divine revelation, the pursuit of truth has always carried risk. The same flame that warms can burn. Maybe the Guidestones' real message wasn't about population or control. Maybe it was a mirror reflecting our endless struggle between the urge to build towers and the need to stay human. So my take on the Georgia Guidestones is I do definitely think that it sounds like Herbert Kirsten, just the parallels between that man and how R.C. Christian, the pseudonym, was described, as well as some other writings, which you can look up online, some of the things that Herbert Kirsten wrote about, right? Definitely sounds like he probably was R.C. Christian. And I do think that rather than acting alone of his own best interest, I think he was acting on behalf of a group of people who had a vested interest in promoting a sort of guide of enlightenment, right? And they probably did think there was going to be this post-apocalyptic world, which probably they're right? We're doing a pretty good job of destroying the planet, of tearing apart our society, and hastening the demise of decorum that's tenuously keeping the globe together at the moment. I don't think that there needs to be any kind of a secret society of global elites that hastens that demise for us. I think that humans are so dysfunctional and so willing to divide ourselves that we're actually just doing it ourselves. And anybody who pays attention to the psychology of groups can see that that's coming, right? So I mentioned that, we're fighting a culture war instead of a class war. That culture war is being fed to us, right? The right versus the left, the secular versus the religious, men versus women. It doesn't really matter. That culture war is purposely being fed to us so that we can't come together and fight the class war, which maybe the true global elites are the people the billionaires who are the less than 1% of the world's population that control over 90% of the world's wealth. That's the war we should be fighting, whether it is physical, ideological, spiritual, or other. So these Guidestones, I do think that they did not have a nefarious purpose in trying to implement some sort of global control order. I do think that they foresaw what we're currently experiencing now, which is society devolving into a culture war because we can't all get on the same page and fight the class war, where the working class actually advocates for itself, comes together unified across the aisle, across all divisions and across all groups, and throws off these sub-identities, right? Like these identity politics that everyone plays on both sides of the aisle. That class war is what actually needs to happen. And by war, I don't mean like physically violent, although it certainly could come to that. I mean pushing back and taking control over our society, our economy, our freedoms, right? So I think that the Guidestones actually alluded to this sort of unity of the working class, because the working class is basically 99.9% of the world's population, right? If you're not a billionaire, you are the working class. You're not one of the elites. And you shouldn't care about the elites because the elites don't care about you. That's kind of the point here. So, in closing, the Guidestones are actually pretty fascinating as far as just their sudden appearance before the age of the internet and before the age of mass information spread and before the age of this like quickly disseminated conspiracies online. The conspiracies surrounding the Guidestones were disseminated like in person, right? And then as the internet began to grow, the conspiracy spread. And then as we saw the rise of like digital currencies and pandemics and unified governments, right, across the world, of course, people drew conclusions and said, oh, these stones were erected by people who wanted this to happen, rather than just going, you know what, these stones probably predicted things that were naturally already going to happen anyway. All right, so we talked about the myths of global order, secret knowledge, spiritual rebellion, how those things shape modern politics, digital culture, how we struggle with freedom, whether it's personal, spiritual, or otherwise. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I'm Sarah Ashman, and this is The Devil's in the Details. Thanks for listening and for keeping the light where it belongs, not above us, but within us. Thanks for listening to The Devil's in the Details, a podcast about conspiracies in the occult, paranormal, and all things weird. You can find me online at Devils in the Deets on Blue Sky. Deets is spelled Deets. You can also reach out with email at devilsinthedeets@proton.me. And again, that is spelled DevilSinthedeets. No apostrophe. Deets is spelled Deets. You can also find this podcast on all major platforms: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. Please follow and subscribe to get updates and notifications when new episodes hit.